Trump and his team resurrect the death penalty. Let's talk about it, y'all. Middle America. Well, I first want to invite, or I don't know what the phrase is, welcome the newest Middle Americans. A couple of you over the last, we've had a surge of people joining up and subscribing. We love you for that. Thank you very, 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 very much. We have a Facebook portal where you can come and hang out and share your thoughts and etc. It's at facebook.com/America Middle. And all you have to do is jump on there, you send a request, you can jump on immediately and you can chat. It's a free speech environment. So unless somebody is doing something like crazily, explicitly evil and calling for violence, we're going to let it fly in that forum. So if you're not the type of person that can countenance that type of interaction, I completely understand. There's nothing wrong with you for that, but that forum is not for you. Okay. Now, yesterday we shot the video of Victor from CNN getting emotional and crying because Trump said that Trump rightly pointed out that Baltimore was infested with rats and guns. I saw a report yesterday, I couldn't quite believe it, that Baltimore had more deaths than Chicago in 2018. And we've all seen the video of the mayor, the black female mayor, walking through and invoking the name of Jesus and saying that we needed to tear the place down because it smelled of dead rats. We saw that. And so somehow that got construed as Trump being racist for daring to tell the truth about Mr. Elijah Cummings' district. And then, of course, the anchor for CNN got all emotional. Now, the last few days, I have been slamming the left incessantly, so much so that many of our friends in Middle America are accusing me of being a Trump supporter and a Trump follower. I'm not. The problem is when the team that you want to win keeps doing things that that make victory in 2020 less and less possible, you get more and more anxiety. And so when people like myself, Jimmy Dore, Tim Pool, and no, I'm not comparing myself to those individuals as far as being able to comment on current events, but when individuals like that are saying very, very similar things, it's pretty silly to accuse us of being pro-Trump, which of course, listening to Tim Pool, I've seen that a lot of his constituents are accusing him of that as well. No, the problem is what we're about to report on in the next 2 minutes. The problem is when you focus on silliness like tweets, then when he imposes more barricades for Central Americans to come in and seek asylum, which he did about a day after he initiated the Ilhan Omar tweets. And then when this happens, and 2 or 3 days before, Trump and his team, namely William Barr, are resurrecting instituting the death penalty, which we haven't done for about 15 years in this country. That's not headline news. What's headline news is a tweet. That is what bothers me. I don't care about what a person says. I don't care about what their opinions are of black people or gay people or whoever. I don't care. What I care about is what they legislate, what their actions are, how their actions affect black and LGBT people, etc., etc., etc. And so we've talked about how Abraham Lincoln was an obvious avowed racist, but the actions that he took in regard to slavery were positive for the black community. Therefore, I support it. And so when Trump does something good for the black community, I will support it. When he does something that's going to have a deleterious effect on the black community, I'm against it. Same thing with my LGBT friends, and same thing with immigrants, etc., etc. So while folks were crying over Trump's tweet, honest tweet and truthful tweet, about the mismanagement of the billions of dollars that we've sent Mr. Elijah Cummings to fix his district, which he's not done. While we were crying over that, federal executions looming, the Democrats' death penalty legacy is coming back to haunt us. This is The Intercept. William Barr announced last week that the Trump administration would restart executions after more than a decade and a half. And I have a serious issue with the death penalty in the United States of America. One is because I'm pro-life. And now I understand the argument, the counter-argument to that, right? The counter-argument is, yeah, Vin, you're pro-life, but the death penalty is instituted to function as a deterrent for murder. And so the death penalty actually functions to preserve life, because when you kill a murderer, it sends a message to a bunch of murderers that this is what's going to happen to you, and that's kind of how it's supposed to function. That's the ideology. The problem is the disproportionate application of said death penalty. You have to understand that black folks account for about 13% of the population, and it's a smaller number when you just look at black males, who are generally the subjects of the death penalty. Now, what's ironic about this channel is that sometimes leftists will accuse me of being a secret Trump follower, and sometimes right-wingers will accuse me of being a leftist. So, that being the case, here's an opinion piece that was written today by Mr. Gerald Olson. Mr. Olson is a member of the Wyoming House of Representatives, by the way. I am a Republican and I oppose restarting federal executions. More and more, conservatives don't trust the government to get capital punishment right. And what he's addressing in this article is that normally the pro-death penalty folks are conservatives and the anti-ones are Democrats or leftists or liberals, whatever you want to call them. But what he's arguing in this piece at the New York Times is that actually more and more people are on the conservative side are starting to rail against capital punishment for the following reasons. In federal cases, as in the states, we have been unable to eradicate arbitrariness from the death penalty lottery. Whether a defendant receives a death sentence is often more dependent on what state he is prosecuted in than on the relative seriousness of his offense. Like state death sentences, federal death sentences are geographically concentrated. Just 3 states, Missouri, Texas, and Virginia, are responsible for almost half of all federal death sentences. So, what you're talking about here is ending the life of a human being. And so, when I hear that 3 states are responsible for nearly 50% of the death penalties, that's a problem. That's a problem. If we were carrying justice across the board, then it should be more evenly distributed, no? Again, this is not a left-wing talking point. This is a right-winger. He's a Republican, and he's a member of the Wyoming House of Representatives. There is an interesting article written in the Christian Scientist Monitor in 1994 by Elliot Richardson and Nicholas Katzenbach. Now, who is Elliot Richardson? Elliot Richardson is a former U.S. Attorney General, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Commerce. Katzenbach is a former U.S. Attorney General. So these are guys that knew their stuff. Listen to this excerpt from their article in the Christian Science Monitor. The name of the article is Base Death Sentences on the Facts, Not Race. Listen to what they said. What if more than 60% of the murder cases a prosecutor handled involved African American victims, yet in cases where he sought the death penalty, more than 80% involved white victims? Did you catch that? I'm going to say it again. More than 60% of the murder cases a prosecutor handled involved African American victims, and yet in cases where he sought the death penalty, more than 80% involved white victims. Basically, if the victim was white, you're more likely to get a death sentence handed down to you than if a victim is black. Throughout our history, race has figured heavily in the death penalty. Before the Civil War, the slave codes mandated execution for any black who murdered a white, but allowed a mere fine for a white who killed a black. Post-war laws continue to require different sentences based on the race of the victim. Today, long after our laws have been sanitized of such overt discrimination, the death penalty continues to be reserved overwhelmingly for cases where the victim is white. Of the 236 people executed since 1976, only 80% of the cases involved white victims, while nearly 50% of the homicide victims each year were non-white. Incredibly, only one in the nation's history has a white been executed for killing a black. where the victim was a police officer and the defendant had also killed another white person. So you got, as of 1994, you had 236 cases of execution, and you had one case where a white person killed a black person, where the individual was executed. These disproportionate numbers are great, and again, these are not hard dyed-in-the-wool left-wingers. As a matter of fact, Mr. Katzenbach goes on to say that he still believes in the death penalty, but there has to be a massive overhaul because there's an obvious racial disparity there. Last month, the House of Representatives voted to redress the inequity. It narrowly passed a Racial Justice Act prohibiting the carrying out of a death sentence that was imposed based on race, but opponents are seeking to exclude it from the comprehensive crime bill, arguing that it will result in racial quotas and spell the end of the death penalty in America. You know the crime bill, the famous Hillary Clinton super predator crime bill that was initiated by the Democrats? So what was happening in 94 was there was this act called the Racial Justice Act, which was designed to fix this inequity, and the proponents of the crime bill were saying, no, we don't really like that because it'll essentially gut the crime bill of its lethal force. You can see it right there. The crime bill, again, was initiated by Mr. Bill Clinton and was propagandized in the media by Mrs. Hillary Clinton when she called us super predators. And I say us, I mean young black youth. So as far back as 1994, people were calling this out and saying, hey, wait a second, we've got an issue here. Here is a scholarly article that was published at Duke University by Aaron Karaminski, Eliminating Discrimination and Administering the Death Penalty, the Need for the Racial Justice Act. So listen to this. A study by the National Sentencing Commission found that blacks are receiving an average sentence of 68.5 months under the federal sentencing guidelines compared to an average sentence of about 44.7 months for whites. State laws and federal guidelines, of course, are written in race-neutral language, but discretion in sentencing is inevitably exists and provides the opportunity for racial discrimination. In this context, it is not surprising that race matters greatly in decisions concerning the death penalty. The most famous study was conducted by law professor David Baldus, who examined the imposition of the death penalty in Georgia. Now, I will be posting the Baldus report. I didn't feature it in this video because it's extremely technical. It has a bunch of tables, and if you want to review it on your own time, fine. The Baldus study found that the prosecutors sought the death penalty in 70% of cases involving a black defendant and a white victim, 15% of cases involving a black defendant and a black victim, and 19% of cases involving a white defendant and a black victim. Many other studies confirm this discriminatory pattern in capital decision making. In Alabama, where the population is 24% black, 43% of the 117 inmates on death row are black. In Philadelphia, where the population is 19% black, a single judge is responsible for sentencing 26 people to death, 92% of whom were black. A nationwide study by the Dallas Times-Herald of 11,425 capital murders from 1977 to 1984 revealed that a killer of a white is nearly 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death than a killer of a black. A study by Samuel Gross and Robert Morrow of capital sentencing in 8 states found that race was a key factor in death penalty decision makings. For example, the study found that defendants in Florida convicted of killing whites were 8 times more likely to receive the death penalty than those convicted of murdering blacks. In Georgia, where 63.5% of homicide victims were black, those who killed whites were 10 times more likely to receive a death sentence than defendants with black victims. Similar evidence is emerging under the limited federal death penalty adopted in 1988 for so-called drug kingpins of 36 defendants against whom a federal death penalty has been sought. 4 defendants were white, 4 were Hispanic, 28 were black. All 10 defendants approved thus far for capital punishment by Attorney General Janet Reno, Clinton-appointed Janet Reno, have all been black. The overall statistics from across the country paint a stark and unequivocal picture. Of the 236 people executed in this country since 1976, over 80% of the cases involved a white victim, while nearly 50% of the homicide victims each of the year were non-white. A 1990 report by the General Accounting Office reviewed 28 different studies and found that they clearly documented a pattern, and now they're quoting the General Accounting Office after they reviewed 28 reports indicating racial disparities in the charging of sentences and imposition of the death penalty, end quote. So, as a person of color with 3 black sons, the imposition, the resurrection of the death penalty after 15 years at the federal level is not a good sign. We need to be moving away in total, as Ilhan Omar said. Ilhan Omar, in this tweet here, says it all. Here's Ilhan: the death penalty is a heinous totalitarian practice often used against innocent people. It is the very definition of cruel and unusual punishment. It has no place in the 21st century America or anywhere else in the world. Now, one caveat I want to say after I read the Ilhan quote, and I agree with her. I am not saying that every study that I just read proves that black people are being killed unjustly, in the sense of they were all innocent, and those numbers are proving that black people were all innocent. What I'm saying is that our justice system has an disproportionate application of who gets killed and who doesn't. It would be one thing if we were just doing the same thing across the board. Now, I'd still be against it, but I wouldn't have a unique concern of it as a black person in America. But as we've just seen from these studies, the Balda study, the Duke study, the testimony of the representative from Wyoming, the Attorney General, who, even though he supported the death penalty, recognized it. And these are voices from both sides of the aisle who are saying this. And then we've got a government institution that reviewed 28 of these reports in depth and said, yeah, there's clearly a racial bias in our application of the death penalty. Well, that being the case, if that's the case, then there needs to be, at minimum, a moratorium on the death penalty. And in a best case scenario, we need to just end it wholesale. On top of the fact that we've got clear evidence of the fact that we've killed a lot of innocent people in this country via the death penalty. This is not something that we should be continuing in our country. This is a very great evil. And this is one of those things where, there's some issues where you can go, whoops, we were wrong. But when you're talking about ending the life of another human being, you better make damn sure that that person is guilty, and you better make damn sure that you're applying the law across the board fairly. There's a lot of things that can be applied unequally, in the sense of, yeah, but it's not something I'm going to fight about. For example, I wasn't necessarily for the forced integration. I wasn't for sit-ins. If a white restaurant owner doesn't want you in his restaurant, my perspective is, go start your own restaurant, get all the black people to go to your restaurant. Now the guy is getting hurt by 13% of revenue. So that's something I'm willing to deal with. What I'm not willing to deal with, though, is a system that has a permanent ramification and permanent consequences, and it's obvious racial bias attached to it. That is not something I am willing to countenance. I'll leave you with this. I've got a 13-year-old son who's going to turn 14 in October. Here's a case of, to my knowledge, the youngest victim of execution in the United States of America. Surprise, surprise, it's a young black male. It took 10 minutes to convict 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. It took 70 years after his execution to exonerate him. Now, asterisks on the term exonerate, we'll get to that in a second. But this is the tragic story of George Stinney, who was blamed for the murder of 2 white girls. He was dragged away by the police. He was not provided any counsel, wasn't able to contact his parents, confessed to killing them. And then it took him 10 minutes to say that this kid needs to be killed. And so the story goes that he was too small to even get to the helmet that was there designed to electrocute him. So they had to put books. They had to sit him on some books because he was too young, because he was a child. He's actually smaller than my son. And He was 5'1", 95 pounds, and they killed him. And then 70 years later, now remember, we learned from the Mueller report that the term exonerate is not the term. So just for complete accuracy. But here is what Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen did when she tossed out his conviction 70 years later. This is what she said. But Wednesday, 70 years after the fact, Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen tossed out his conviction, which was reached after a trial that didn't even last a full day and was never appealed. As the Associated Press noted, it took Mullen nearly 4 times as long to issue her ruling as it took in 1944 to go from arrest to execution. It's almost like the Tamir Rice video where the cop went and shot the kid in under 2 seconds. Killed him. So it took more time for her to read her decision than it took for them to declare this kid guilty and kill him. I can think of no greater injustice, Mullen wrote in her 29-page order. He was arrested. There is no physical evidence linking him to the crime. He wasn't even allowed to see his parents after he was apprehended. Given the particularized circumstances of Stinney's case, I find by a preponderance of the evidence standard that a violation of the defendant's procedural due process right tainted his prosecution. Stinney's sister, Amy's rich, deep voice resonates with the vowels of her birthplace, but recalling her last words to George, it alters as if she's gone back in time to the high-pitched voice of a girl. I said, "Oh, George, are you leaving me? Where are you going?" He told me to find Charles and Catherine and tell them that he was being taken away. I never saw him again until he was in his casket. That is something I will always see in my memories. His face was burned. This kid is smaller than my kid. My kid's gonna turn 14 in October. And, when you're a black parent, you have these conversations with your especially if you have sons, because they need to know what type of country they're in. And you go, "Oh, that was 1944." Well, again, Tamir Rice was executed in a shorter period of time than this kid was. Look, y'all, this is a reason I get angry at Democrats when they keep falling into these games that Trump plays on Twitter. This is a terrible, terrible, terrible move in our country. This is a move, as the Republican who I initially quoted in the New York Times said, this is a step in the wrong direction. We're going backwards. What we need to do is abolish the death penalty as a whole in this country. We've killed too many innocent people, and we've applied this law in as a pattern of injustice. And this is not an issue where we can go, we were wrong, we'll correct it later. People are dying. And so when I see somebody crying over going into political theater because Trump said that, the place is infested with rats, which it is. There's a documentary called Rats in regard to Baltimore. And then the word racism gets thrown out every 2 seconds. It cheapens and it dilutes and it diverts attention away from the real issues. This is a real issue. The reinstitution of killing these people. Now look, I understand Trump, I think one of the guys that's up for death is a white supremacist. The other guy is somebody that did something horrible to a child. The other guy did something horrible to an elderly person. I get it for this particular group of people. But what I'm looking at is the entire body of work of the United States of America. And the fact that we're resurrecting it on the federal level does not comport to the idea that we're going to have it abolished at the state and federal level. And that's my problem. And so, George Stinney is something to cry about. Crying for George Stinney makes a lot of sense to me. Crying for Elijah Cummings does not. And once again, to my white liberal friends who want to tell me as a black man what what is important and what is not important. Things like this are important to me. Legislation is important to me. Actions are important to me. That's what's important to me. Somebody sending a tweet, not important. Not important to me. Somebody dissing a state representative who has been getting billions of dollars and has done nothing with it, not important to me. A kid that looks younger and smaller than my oldest son being killed by an unjust system is important to me. And our country making permanent mistakes is important to me. And I hope it should be important to you. All right. Love your neighbor. Take care of each other. Middle America, we are the media. Till next time, guys.